Did you know humans can perceive only 30% of the sun's light and 1/70th of the spectrum of electromagnetic energy? Many animals exceed these abilities. Bats detect insects by sonar. Pigeons navigate magnetic fields. Bloodhounds can smell through time. Naturally, nothing makes humans particularly excel, but humans do have a spiritual sense. That's why, when Paul preached in Athens, he wanted to show the Athenians how small their perception of God was, and that the world was bigger than the universe, and that God was bigger than the universe, and yet not separate from it. That the God of infinity was drawing finite people to himself and inviting them into a relationship that meant living, moving, and being in the God who was simply more. And that for them, and for us, means three things that come our way: more life, more action, more being. Our scripture reading this morning is taken from Matthew chapter 9, verses 18 to 26. This can be found on page 9 in the New Testament portion of your Pew Bible. Reading from Matthew chapter 9, beginning at verse 18. Hear what the Spirit says to the church. While he was saying the things to them, suddenly a leader of the synagogue came in and knelt before him, saying, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live." And Jesus got up and followed him with his disciples. Then suddenly a woman who had been suffering from hemorrhages for 12 years came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak, for she said to herself, "If I only touch his cloak, I will be made well." Jesus turned, and seeing her, he said, "Take heart, daughter, your faith has made you well." And instantly the woman was made well. When Jesus came to the leader's house and saw the flute players and the crowd making a commotion, he said, "Go away, for the girl is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. But when the crowd had been put outside, and he went in and took her by the hand, the girl got up, and the report of this spread throughout that district. This is the word of the Lord.
It's even longer when I don't turn my microphone on. 12 years is a long time. 12 years ago, Facebook was just in its infancy. 12 years ago, if you wanted to send someone a text message, you had to press each button on your cell phone 4 or 5 times for each letter you wanted. And you paid 35 cents for every single one of those texts. 12 years ago, Pluto was still a planet. A lot can happen in 12 years. In the last 12 years of your life, think about all the people that you've come across, the milestones you've celebrated, the births, the loves, the marriages, the baptisms, the confirmations, the jobs you've had, the places you've lived. The sheer scope of everything that can happen in just 12 years boggles the imagination. And yet, it depends on how you measure those 12 years. 12 years ago, I preached for the very first time. I stood up with what I considered with a carefully prepared paper, I hesitate to call it a sermon, wearing exactly what I would have worn to church: a t-shirt, shorts, and sandals. 12 years can seem either like an instant or like an eternity, depending on your point of reference. And 12 years ago, I preached on this exact passage. And so when I reflect on all of the things that have happened to me over the last 12 years, when I think about all the people that I've loved, the hugs I've received, the handshakes I've shared, the touches I've felt, there's a part of me that where my heart breaks for the eternity this woman must have experienced. Because for 12 years, according to the ceremonial rules of her time, she was unclean. She was labeled. She was impure. She was broken. For 12 years, she'd never been able to hug her children, to kiss her husband, to hold hands with someone close to her, to even brush shoulders against someone at the marketplace would render them impure as well. I don't remember what I said when I preached on this passage 12 years ago, and I doubt anyone else does either. Yet for me, this unnamed woman's story continues to resonate. It speaks to me not just because Jesus commends her for her faith, and I think we can look at her story and learn something from our own faith as well, but because broadly, her story is the church's story. The church knows what it is, frankly speaking, to not be able to stop the bleeding. 40 years ago, the Presbyterian Church in Canada reached its high water mark, and we've been hemorrhaging members ever since. Like her, we've gone to doctors, we've paid for experts, and we've been sold cures that never seem to work. And every day, the bleeding continues. But I believe that into our story, Jesus is speaking life. I believe that into our story, Jesus is inviting us to experience the God who is quite simply more. And he's inviting us to experience that God when we recognize that grace happens in life's interruptions. In 1973, inspired by the parable of the Good Samaritan, Princeton psychologists John Darley and Dan Batson conducted an experiment on time pressure and helpful behavior. They studied how students at the Princeton Theological Seminary conducted themselves when asked to deliver a sermon on the Good Samaritan. The students were to give the sermon in a building across campus and would be evaluated by their supervisors. The research was curious about whether time pressure would affect the seminary students' helpful nature. After all, these were students studying to become ministers and presumably inclined to be helpful. As each student finalized their preparation in the classroom, the researchers inflicted an element of time constraint on them by giving them one of 3 instructions. You're late. They were expecting you a few minutes ago. You better hurry. It shouldn't take more than a minute. This was the high hurry condition. 2, the assistant is ready for you. Please go right over. This was the intermediate hurry condition. Or 3, it'll be a few minutes before they're ready for you. But you might as well head over now. This was the low hurry condition. As each student walked by himself from the preparation classroom to the studio, they encountered a victim in a deserted alleyway, just like the wounded traveler in the parable of the Good Samaritan. This victim, actually an associate of the experimenters, appeared destitute, was slouched and coughing and clearly in need of assistance. The seminarians were thus offered a chance to apply what they were about to preach. Researchers were interested in determining if their imposed time pressure affected the student's response to a distressed stranger. Remarkably, only 10% of the students in the high hurry situation stopped to help the victim. 45% of the students in the intermediate hurry and only 63% of students in the low hurry situation helped. We live lives so absolutely jammed with things to do that we often miss opportunities for grace in the world around us. In our rush to get to coffee, we miss the mother who's busy putting on her children's boots. In our obsession with excellence, we miss the simple offering of a broken, fragile gift. In our desire to give the world to our kids, we never stop to think about what they actually need. In our rush to create programs, we stop shaping hearts. As a society, we are busier than we even realize we are. If you don't believe me, go home today and open up the sent folder in your email. And try to picture every one of those emails that you sent, even in the last week, as a letter, and how high that pile would be stacked if each email was a sheet of paper. Because functionally, an email isn't any less work than sitting down to write a letter would be. But because we can do it from anywhere, because we can do it from our phone or our iPad or our laptop, somehow we forget how busy we have made ourselves. And so because we are too busy to tell ourselves there is simply no time to stop for the unimportant things. But for Jesus, no one was too unimportant to stop for. This woman's story comes in the middle of another, arguably more important story. And it's in the middle of this travel that Jesus stops and recognizes the sheer, simple faith of this broken woman. Everything in this story tells us that Jesus is in a high-hurry condition. A little girl's life is hanging by a thread. And even if Jesus could heal this faithful woman with his presence, he doesn't need to stop and make a show of her. But none of that is how Jesus works. Jesus is never too busy for grace, because he knows what we forget all the time, that nothing plus infinity will always be enough. Does the temple leader's daughter die? Yeah, she does. Would she have died before Jesus got there anyway? Probably. But if nothing plus infinity is always enough, we have to believe that God is big. What Jesus believes, that God is bigger even than death. That there is no amount of God that we can miss out on to stop and show an ounce of grace to a world that needs it. God will provide enough for us to show grace and to do what we need to do. Take yourself out of whatever high-hurry mindset you find yourself in, and let this story serve for us as a reminder in a church that is incredibly busy to slow down. As the choir sang, to be still and know that I am God. I love that phrase because be still is not actually a very good translation. The Hebrew actually, the Hebrew verb that we translate as be still really means to release, to let go. A more accurate translation is something akin to let go and know that I am God. Take yourself out of the high-hurry situation. Forget how busy you need to be. Forget the standard of life and expectation and programs that you've set for yourself. And take the opportunities to step back from the gas pedal of life and find the space for the gracious interruptions that God is putting in your path. Because here's the part that I absolutely love about this story. Jesus can do more by accident than we can with our best effort. Jesus can do more by accident than we can with our best efforts. Because in a sea of people touching him and plowing into him, Jesus notices the little tug on the hem of his garment. The text paints a picture of people thronging around Jesus, clamoring over him, lots of people touching him, bristling up against him, asking him questions, walking beside him just for that opportunity to be near him. The disciples were told elsewhere in the New Testament and in the Gospels would fight to be next to Jesus. Lots of people are touching him, but he still notices her. I wonder how much time we spend trying to get Jesus to notice us. How much time we spend pushing to get to the center, only to make things worse. See, if this woman had pushed, the situation wouldn't be as neat and tidy and as commendable as it was. If this woman had pushed, she would have made every single person that she touched as ritually impure as she was. She would have made it impossible even for the temple leader to hold his daughter when Jesus got there. But she doesn't push. She doesn't demand that she be at the center. She's content to simply reach out and say, if I can just get a little bit closer. And Jesus can do more by accident than we can with our best efforts. when we look from the perspective of history, every time Christians push, we end up pushing people away. From colonial conquests around the world designed with good intentions to bring the gospel to every corner of the earth, to the modern day legacy of residential schools led by, again, well-intentioned church leaders, we continue in the church today to bear responsibility for the ways that we have pushed and pushed and pushed to bring Jesus' worldview to bear in our terms, in our way, and with our thinking. We push to get close, but Jesus' grace happens outside of our pushing. Jesus can do more by accident than we can with our best efforts. And what's more is that Jesus notices it. Jesus is so carefully attuned to the grace that he is bringing into the world that he notices the small changes. Beth sent me to go pick out paint samples for the baby's room. And when you walk into the paint store, you are confronted with an array of whites. There's white, off-white, eggshell, and cream. There's 100 other variations that all, to me, looked identical. And with a condescending attitude, the clerk at the paint store seemed befuddled that I couldn't understand the difference between white and off-white. But I don't spend every day in a paint store staring at the array of colors, learning and training my eyes and my senses to observe the subtle distinctions. So too, we go through life every day not noticing the simple and subtle changes in the ways that God is inflicting grace on our world in subtle, strange, and wonderful ways day after day after day. But Jesus notices. Because Jesus is so carefully attuned, so cautiously and wonderfully paying attention to the atmosphere of grace around him that he notices every single change. And he's willing to work outside of us if that's where grace happens. Because life happens in the interruptions and it happens outside of our clamor. And I think that at the end of the day, this is good news because it means that I don't have to get all the way to Jesus for Jesus to get all the way to me. We like to draw circles around Jesus. You see it even in this passage. The crowd throngs around Jesus, a circle of people so no one from the outside can get close. In the church, we call those circles theology, and we set them up as boundaries. The goal for us is to get as many people across an imaginary dotted line as possible, to make as many Presbyterians as we can in as little time as we have left. Get them to check the boxes, say the right prayer, sign their name on the dotted line, and become regular attenders and donors. But this story challenges our approach to church, I think, in two ways. Because sometimes boundaries can become barriers. Sometimes the beliefs that define us mean that people can't check the boxes or can't say the prayers, that they can't sign their name on the dotted line, so they'll never become donors or attenders. One of the first arguments that the church ever had was whether or not to require Gentiles to keep the same food laws that Jews kept. And so the church prayed, the church studied, and looked at the question of what God had done in the past. What did God's word have to bear to this current situation? Ultimately, they looked at Jesus and determined that that particular cultural boundary had become a barrier for the gospel. They summed it up this way: if we add anything to the price that God paid to reach us, we empty the cross of its meaning. Secondly, it reminds me of the challenge that it's not good enough to even to just get across the line if that's where you stop. The definition of discipleship, according to Eugene Peterson, is a life lived in a long obedience in the same direction. A life lived in long obedience in the same direction. If only I could reach out and touch the hem of his garment, the woman thought. Just a little bit closer would be close enough to Jesus, she said. And close enough to Jesus is close enough for Jesus to get all the way to me. For me, that's what this table represents. That's why I love coming to this table week after week after week. This table is a chance for me to remember that it's time to slow down, to release, to let God get to me. Because that's what this table says. This table says God is coming to us. There's nothing we can do to earn our seat at this table. There's nothing we can do to keep our seat at this table. It's a daily dependence and steadfast determination to follow a long obedience in the same direction. To recognize that God's grace happens whether we want it to or not, and that God can do more by accident than we can with our best efforts. So the invitation to come is here today. The table is set before us. But for now we sing. For now we worship. For now we give God what he alone is due. Let us respond to God in praise.